right, y'all. Chilling at the house right now. Um, Let me get into this word. Um, this is deep. This is real deep. I want to talk to you about the other voice of God. The other voice of God. This is heavy. And it might be a little different than what you've heard. But we know that God speaks in several different ways. But I want to share another voice of God coming from the same. And I'll show you in the Word and prove it to you. There's another voice of God. And you have to know which one you're hearing. Because some may say that God hasn't spoken to them, and indeed He has. But you was listening for a different voice of God than the one that He spoke to you with. So you may have thought that He did not speak, but yet He did. You just did not realize it or recognize that voice. So go with me to 1 Kings, the 19th chapter, and let's look at this experience that Elijah had. All right, I'll start from verse 4, and I'm going to read down a little bit and then expound on some of it to help you to get a little bit of this picture here so that this makes sense. So this is speaking concerning Elijah, the prophet. 1 Kings 19, verse 4. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came down to a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die, and said, "It is enough now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." So Elijah is praying for God to take his life. He's tired, he's sick of it. And here's what happens in verse 5. Then as he lay and slept under the broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." Then he looked, and there was by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lied down again. So the angel provided some food for Elijah. Verse 7. The angel of the Lord came back the second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, watch this, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, right here, you might think that this is the angel speaking to him, but it is not, because of his response in verse 10. Watch his response. So he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, your covenant, your covenant. Whose covenant was it? It was God's covenant. Your covenant. Torn down your altars. Whose altars was it? It was God's altars. Your altars. And killed your prophets. Whose prophets were they? They were God's prophets. With the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. So, we see that the angel of the Lord was speaking to Elijah from verse 4, actually from verse 5 down to verse 8. And it would appear that that angel was still speaking to him in verse 9, when the word of the Lord came to him saying, what are you doing here? You might think that that meant that the word of the Lord came to him through that angel. No, not through the angel, because he responds to the voice in verse 10. And the language that he's speaking in is he's saying, your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets. Now, they were not the angels' prophets. They were not the angels' altars. They were not. That was not the angels' covenant. That was God's covenant. That was God's altar. That was God's prophets. So we know that Elijah was communicating to God between verse 9 and verse 10. So that wasn't the angel there, but everything before that was the angel speaking to him. So we see that Elijah is hearing from God here. He's getting information from God, he's hearing from God, and he's communicating with God right here. So this is one voice of God. Let me show you the other voice of God. Watch this. Verse 11. Then he said, go out and stand. And so this is God speaking. He's already speaking. So he said, go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Now watch this. Now we see that God was already speaking to Elijah from verse 10 and verse 11 down. We see that God was already speaking to Elijah. He was already hearing his voice, and he was communicating with God. But then the presence of the Lord passes, and a strong wind, broke the rocks into pieces. And then after the wind, there was an earthquake, and then after an earthquake, there was a fire. But the Lord was not in any of these mighty things, many of these big things, the big great wind. He wasn't in that. The earthquake, he wasn't in that. And the fire, he wasn't in that. These could have been results that followed his presence, but those things was not what he was in. After that, we see that there's a still small voice. Now it's interesting because here it doesn't tell us that he was in the still small voice, but yet it tells us everything else that happened, which was the wind, the fire, and the earthquake. It tells us that he was not in those things. But when it comes to the still small voice, it doesn't say that he was in the still small voice. Neither does it say it was God. But here's how we can infer that it was God, because of the response that Elijah gives in the next verse. Watch this. And suddenly, so watch this. Verse 12. And after that, there was an earthquake, and then there was a fire, and then after the fire was a still small voice. Verse 13. So it was. Watch Elijah's response. Sorry about that reflection of the sun, y'all. Watch Elijah's response. So when he heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went and stood in the entrance of the cave. And suddenly a voice came to him, and it said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So watch this. The still small voice shows up. Elijah hears it, and then he covers his face with his mantle. Now, the covering of the face with the mantle back in the Old Testament was a symbol or a sign of respect. So we know that even though it doesn't say that the Lord was in the still small voice, or it doesn't say that, the Bible doesn't tell us that that voice was God, we know that it was because of the response that Elijah gives by covering his face up with his mantle, showing respect to it. Now, here's what I want to show you. There's a difference between the still small voice and the voice that Elijah was just hearing before all of these things took place. The still small voice is different than the voice of God, which was the word of the Lord came to me saying. The word of the Lord came to me saying. Before all of these mighty things happened, the wind, the fire, and the earthquake, the word of the Lord already came to Elijah saying. So he was already hearing that way. But then another voice of God comes to him in the form of a still small voice. And this one doesn't say anything about saying anything. We don't see anything being said. It doesn't say what it told him. It doesn't say that it told him anything. It just says that it was a still small voice. And all we see in verse 13 is that Elijah is responding to that voice by wrapping his face up with his mantle, covering his face with his mantle to show respect to it. And then he goes and stands in the entrance of the mountain of the cave, and suddenly a voice comes to him, which was that other voice that he heard before saying the same thing. Elijah, what are you doing here? So here's what you've got to understand. Now I'm getting to the title of this video. The other voice of God. There is a voice of God that speaks. The word of the Lord came to me saying. The word of the Lord came to me saying. which was what Elijah was hearing before these things took place. Then after these things took place, another voice of God came, which was identified as the still small voice. It doesn't say that that voice was saying anything. So there's a voice of God that says something, and there's a voice of God that does not say, does not speak anything. Let me prove it to you. If you was to go to, in the original King James Version of the Bible, now you won't see it in the New King James Version, but if you go to the original King James Version and you read in Genesis 3 and 8, you will find that the voice of God was walking, that Adam and Eve, when they sinned, they heard the voice of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Get it? The voice of God. They heard the voice of God walking. The voice of God walking. This would be tied into a presence. I'm going to say that again. This would be tied into a presence. They heard the voice of God walking. Not the voice of God saying. They heard the voice of God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. So there is a voice of God that is identified by a presence. It doesn't say anything. It's just a presence. This is what the still small voice is. It is a presence that doesn't say anything. It's just a presence. But even though it doesn't say anything, it's still called a voice. Just like in Genesis 3 and 8, in the original King James Version, the voice of God was walking in the garden. Didn't say anything, but it was still called the voice, based on being a presence. So there is a voice of God that speaks information, and there's a voice of God that manifests a presence. Now, the still small voice, understand, the stillness represents peace. Stillness is symbolic of peace. So here's what Elijah heard when he heard the still small voice. He didn't hear anything being told to him. That's why we don't see that the still small voice said anything, because it wasn't speaking. It was a presence that showed up in the form of peace. And that was called the voice. So sometimes, watch this, sometimes God will be speaking to you based on information being given to you, whether that be through dream, whether that be through vision, whether that be through spiritual sensitivity, revelation, biblical information, whether it be any of those things. Sometimes he'll be speaking to you through that. But then there's another voice of God that shows up not speaking anything. It shows up in the form of a presence, which is identified by peace, stillness. So here's what might happen to you sometimes, and I'm going to help you to understand that God is speaking to you. You may get into prayer, and as you're praying, you may come to a point of prayer where the atmosphere has changed, where a presence of peace has come. You're not hearing anything, you're not getting any information, not even getting any revelation, but a stillness showed up, a presence of peace. That is his voice too. It's not it's the other voice that is different than the informational based voice. There's the informational based voice, and then there's the voice that's not based off of information. It's based off of a presence. So what you do when the informational voice shows up is you receive that word and you obey that word. You do whatever he says. But if the presence shows up that's not based on information, it's just a peace, then when that shows up, your response should be respect. Now, how you respect it is through worship, through praise, whatever you have to do in order to show respect to the atmosphere, the presence that has showed up from God in the form of peace. Elijah responded by covering his face with his mantle. And when he did that, he got another word from God, which was actually a reminder or a confirmation of the same word. And the Lord said to him, "What are you doing here?" So, watch this. If God speaks to you, not by the informational voice, but by the voice of peace, and you show respect to that presence, then what will happen afterwards is the word of the Lord will come to you saying, the informational voice will come to you after that. So that's what you do. That's what you do. There you have it, y'all. Hopefully that clarifies God speaking to you. So he's been speaking all along. It's just sometimes he's not speaking with the informational voice. Sometimes he's speaking with the voice of peace, the still small voice, the presence, that same presence that Adam and Eve heard, the voice of God walking in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day. There you have it, y'all. Peace.